Yeah, please, you should be able to go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you for introduction. So I think I need to introduce myself to many of you who were not present the last time, 2 years ago in Tokyo. Hisashi Obuchi. So the last 2 years ago, I was studying at the University of Tokyo, but later I've got a good opportunity here in Freiburg in Germany. Then I'm now writing my dissertation under the supervision of Professor Nadia Gamma. Right. So, my presentation is about Zainuddin Kashi, who was active in the late 12th century to the 13th century, probably around in Herat or in today's Afghanistan. And I'm talking about his conception of philosophical writing, especially what he wanted to achieve by writing philosophy. So let me review of Kashi and the last time presentation. So Zainuddin Kashi, as I said, is most best known as a prominent student of the great Sunni theologian philosopher Fakhruddin Razi. And it is true that Razi is an important and perhaps the most important source of Kashi's philosophy, but we cannot simply say that Kashi was a follower of Razi. So for example, recent studies have shown that Kashi was a quite unique expert in Arabic logic. And in fact, logicians in 13th century referred to him even as al-Imam or al-Allama, rather than as a student of Razi. And one of the most popular works of Kashi was Hadaiq al-Haqaiq, Gardens of Realities. And this is a philosophical summa, which means it treats not only logic, but also physics, so element tabi'i and metaphysics. But the material I use for the present paper is only the introduction of this Hadaiq al-Haqaiq, which is around 10 pages in print. And then, yeah, in my presentation two years ago, titled Zainuddin Kashi on Taqlid as a Spiritual Disease and Philosophers as Guiding Elites. So I dealt with the Kashi's notion of Taqlid in the introduction of the Hadaiq. Taqlid, which I would translate unreflective acquisitions to others, is, as you know, a crucial term in Islamic thought. And Al-Kashi also employs this concept, widely accepted concept, but he used this concept to explain the role of the intellectuals or philosophers or scholars in general. So his argument goes as follows. First, all humans are commanded by God to recognize God. And so recognize God and his existence and his uniqueness or oneness. And for that purpose, every human is created with an intellect or human reason, aql in Arabic. However, Al-Kashi continues, not everyone can fulfill this obligation to recognize God, despite the intellect equally given to each person. Al-Kashi divides people, so people in Arabic, al-nas, into two groups. First, on the one hand, muhaqqiqs, so by nature seek for truth. To quote, their souls never rest but on the delight of certitude, so they will never accept but what is elucidated by clear demonstration, end quote. And the rest of people are muqallis, who do nothing but taqlid and follow others without any reflection upon their reliability. It should be noted here and that Al-Kashi doesn't say that muhaqqiqs are like learned or expert in respective each subject, nor does he say that muqallids are irrational or like stupid. So because each human is given an intellect, so we cannot say that Muqallid is irrational. So this point will become very important later. So according to Kashi, the serious problem caused by the taqlid of muhaqqiqs is that because their models are also ignorant, so the muqallids who follow the models, the ignorant models, become likewise ignorant of God. So because, and that which means the muqallids who follow the ignorant models will also go to hell. But importantly, Al-Kashi does not abandon or leave behind the muqallids. So he goes on to say that it is rather the intellectual elites who are responsible for the ignorance and unhappiness of muqallids. He argues that the perfect intellectual, the Aqil al-Kamil, have three tasks to perform. First, they must guide themselves to the straight way by proofs, namely demonstrations, especially demonstrations and other kinds of evidence. So these are required to show their reliability to the fellow muhaqqiqs. And second, the intellectuals must treat the patients of taqlid. So that is, so Al-Kashi says in other words, they must make an effort to guide muqallids to the correct view. So here it is interesting that Kashi doesn't say the intellectuals must make muqallids, so change muqallids into muhaqqiqs. He only said that he must make he must make an effort to guide muqallids to the correct view. And the third step, the third duty, that task, is that the perfect intellectuals must write a book and inscribe their knowledge in it. So as the title of our workshop has. And so when you look at the works of Muslim theologians, philosophers, you quite often find the criticism taqlid. So because of this, so the last time my previous draft stuck to the second point, that treat the patients taqlid and guide muhaqqiqs with the correct view. And I tried to understand the Kashi's text as a critique of taqlid, but as I worked on my paper, I came to think that the most important point is the third and final task of the intellectuals, that is the obligation to inscribe knowledge. So in fact, Kashi deals with this three-step duty of the intellectuals in the introduction to the Hadith. So I think it is more reasonable to take the final task to write as a sort of justification for his writing in general and writing the Hadith. But here I have some questions. The first, why do the intellectuals have to write, not like, for example, orally teach or some other kinds of method? And so as in late antiquity, Muslim philosophers often said that the goal of philosophy is human perfection, or to perfect the soul by grasping the realities of things or by knowing things as they really are. The major philosophers such as Ibn Sina and Mullah Sadr as well start their philosophical books with such a definition of philosophy. But Al-Kashi also writes in the introduction of the Hadith that philosophy, hikmah, is to seek perfection both in the reflective faculty by recognizing realities and in the practical faculty by doing good things. However, so Arabic philosophers like Ibn Sina and Mullah Sadr do not discuss the reason why they employ writing as a method to do philosophy. And it seems as if that they take it for granted that they write their philosophical teachings. I think this is an interesting feature of Islamic philosophy because So value and significance of writing is itself a philosophical question. So some philosophers some philosophers think that writing is not the best method to communicate knowledge or communicate philosophy. So for example, as you know, so in Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates says, no quote, no discourse worth Theo's attention has ever been written in verse or prose. And he also says, only what is said for the sake of understanding and learning, and what is truly written in the soul concerning what is just, noble, and good can be clear, perfect, and worth serious attention. So, I mean, the writing philosophy is not it is considered often not the best way to do philosophy. But in Arabic philosophers seems to take it for granted that they write their philosophical thoughts on the paper. And yeah, so as far as I'm aware, so no major figures in Islamic philosophy, in the history of philosophy in the Islamic world, did not at least explicitly deal with the question of why philosophers write. Kashi argues that it is necessary for the intellectuals to inscribe their knowledge, but why is it not the necessity to orally teach, for example? So my aim in my paper is to analyze Al-Kashi's argumentation and thus find an answer to the question of why philosophers write as understood by him. So as I said, Kashi argues for the duty to write in relation to the distinction between muhakkik and muqallis. So therefore, the readership of the Hadaik must also correspond, at least to some extent, to both types of people, so that he can comply with the first two requirements, namely to guide himself and to guide muqallis. So otherwise, Al-Kashi, for no reason, divides people into muhakkiks and muqallis, and for no reason divides the mission of the intellectual leads into 3 steps. Therefore, we need to investigate the audience of the Hadaik. So according to Kashi, the Hadaik was composed with 2 specific groups of readers in mind. The first and the most, the primary audience is his brethren, Ikhwan in Arabic. So who they aspire to philosophy in the time when its heritage is endangered. So he writes, for them, the Hadaik observes the middle between insufficiency and prolixity in such a scope and a scale that will not be considered insufficient but immoderate. The Kashi does not clarify who the brethren exactly are. They may be his disciples or fellows, but they can also include students of philosophy who he did not know in person. So in any case, the most important point is that first, these brethren are still beginners or perhaps intermediate learners of the subject. So they require some concise treatments of or explanations of the subject. And the second important point is that they have a passionate interest in philosophy and human perfection. So in other words, they are muhakkiks according to the division of Akashi made. So the second group of readers is what I called strangers to philosophy, who do not have a particular interest in philosophy or may even hate it. However, even if so, they may look at his written work. With such potential readers in mind, Kashi has, quote, added such units of philosophy that people should have a good opinion on philosophy, that it is more proper as discourse and clearer as evidence. So as a result, according to Kashi, the Hadaik can benefit readers at 2 different stages of philosophical learning. So he writes, quote, the compilation has become such that it has satisfaction, sufficiency, reminder, and guidance for both those who content themselves with the truth and for those who benefit from the clarity of proof, end quote. So importantly, Al-Kashi thinks this feature makes the Hadith the best of the concise books ever written of this sort. So group A, so the beneficiaries A, is certainly muhaqqiq, since they are people who become satisfied with the truth. So they are muhaqqiqs. But the group B, which I call novices in philosophy, who want the clarity of truth, is a little bit more complicated or problematic. So logically saying, it can, so the group B can be either all muhaqqiqs or all muqallis or both muhaqqiqs and muqallis. But I'll argue that group B are both muhaqqiqs and muqallis. So on the one hand, muhaqqiqs are not necessarily experts in philosophy, as I said before. So as defined by Al-Kashi, muhaqqiqs are people who become satisfied with certitude and truth, which means that some muhaqqiqs are still at an earlier stage of philosophical learning. So even though they by nature pursue certitude and truth. On the other hand, group B can also include the muqallis. So like in the case of the muhaqqiqs, the to be muqallis does not mean that he or she is irrational, because as noted, all individuals are created with intellect or human reason, so by which they can know the realities beyond the sensory perceptions. So therefore, I argue the hadith is beneficial to both muhaqqiqs and muqallis, so Al-Kashi considers it the best. So Al-Kashi says that the intellectuals must inscribe knowledge, but he does not explicitly say why they must write rather than like orally teach. So an obvious advantage of writing is that what is written remains much longer than, so in most cases, much longer than what is spoken. And this nature is also noticed by Al-Kashi. But I think a more significant nature of written words, at least according to Kashi, becomes clear in light of the muhaqqiq and muqallid distinction and the beneficiaries of the hadith. The greatest advantage of writing is that by written words, the writer can reach people outside that circle. So I got this hint from Strauss. So in Persecution and the Art of Writing, so German-American philosopher, political philosopher, Leo Strauss writes that pre-modern philosophers, quote, believed that the gulf separating the wise and the vulgar was a basic fact of human nature which could not be influenced by any progress of popular education. Philosophy or science was essentially a privilege of the few, end quote. Strauss then claims that philosophers therefore only indicate essential teachings between the line so that they will not be persecuted by the unphilosophical majority of people. So this distinction Strauss makes between the wise and the vulgar reminds one that Al-Kashi makes between muhaqqiqs and muqallis, but I don't mean to say that Al-Kashi was persecuted so that he had to write something philosophical essential only between the lines. So, but rather I want to draw attention to the very basic fact from which Strauss developed his idea, which is, quote, writings are naturally accessible to all who can read. So according to Strauss, so because writings are naturally accessible to all who can read, philosophers must care careful about their writings, and they had to write something essential in between the lines. So in most cases, oral teachings are not transmitted beyond to people who are not present at the session, like this seminar. So words disappear, so by nature disappear once they are pronounced. So, but by contrast, written words can be received someone outside the circle. So as Leo Strauss noted, that is also a weakness of written words. And so Plato writes in Phaedrus also, quote, when it has once been written down, every discourse, logos, roams about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding no less than those who have no business with it. But for Kashi, so this nature of written words is rather favorable because he as an intellectual, as a philosopher, must write not only for his disciples or not only for muhakkiks, but also he must write this hadaik or write in general for the mukallis he otherwise cannot reach, so the mukallis outside the circle. And then let me conclude briefly. So Kashi's insight into human nature or philosophy and language, and especially written words, is remarkable in terms of so both philosophically or historically. So he seems, to my knowledge, he seems to be the first Muslim philosopher to address the significance of writing in philosophy. So the result of my study sort of challenges the characterizations of Kashi as like a logician or as senior student of Razi. So rather, it has been shown that Kashi was a quite unique philosopher. Thank you.
Thank you, Hisashi. So yes, so we have now a bit of time, just about 11, 12 minutes for questions. So I think, wait a second, someone had a hand up. Does someone have their hand up? No. Okay. So does anyone have any questions or any comments? Nadia, please go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for this presentation, Hisashi. I just have a couple of questions and one short remark. So for one thing I would like to know is what exactly do you refer to or do you have in mind when you use the term philosophy? So do you have a specific tradition in mind, like whatever is post-Avicennian and in line with Avicenna in a way or other? So what would be the group of people you have in mind? And then my second question concerns this distinction between muhakkik and muqallid. What I was wondering, and I'm now of course in a way referring to discussions we already had earlier, but still, I was wondering, what is the distinguishing feature between these two groups of people, so the majority people and the other people who are true muhakkiks? I got the sense from what you said now, and that would be in contradistinction, for instance, to Al-Farabi, who also has a certain distinction between people, but based on their natural endowment, their natural disposition. I had the impression that what is the feature here for Kashi is not the natural disposition, so being more or less intelligent, but it's rather individual inclination or something like willingness, readiness to look for the truth in a specific way or not to do so. So it seems to be rather a practical, practical kind of feature, and not so much a feature concerning the natural disposition. And now the last thing would be the remark that I mentioned. What I find very interesting is this explicit emphasis Kashi puts on writing. So it's a duty to write for someone, for an akil. What came to mind as you emphasized this aspect was some aspect or some current traditions in the past, in the more classical or formative period, which may be some sort of inspiration for Kashi. I'm not sure, but what immediately came to mind was, for instance, Abu Uthman al-Jahid from the 9th century, and perhaps more generally speaking, certain lines within the adab tradition, where you can find explicit, not just praise of books, of writing, you should say kitab, so in the sense of writing. It's not just praise, but it's focused on what you were zooming in on, namely the fact that first it persists. So in contrast to spoken words, which perish after they are spoken, written words persist, they continue to exist, and they are distributed, they move on, they are not local in the sense of you utter them where you are and then they're away, but they get distributed, they move, there is a transmission of writing. So exactly this, particularly the second aspect, was the one that you were highlighting with regard to Kashi. This is something which you find in these kind of writings that I have in mind, like in Jahiz, but also in others that I could mention. Thank you.
Thank you for questions and comments. No, thank you for the information of the Jahiz and Adab traditions. So that I will look at it. So as to the questions, so for the first, the philosophy, the term philosophy. So I use the term philosophy in somewhat an unstable way, but philosophy, I mean, I use this term philosophy in a general way, like the Kashi does so. So Kashi prefers to use hikmah instead of falsafa, and by that I think he is using the term philosophy hikmah or philosophers hukama in a way that we can call like Ghazali a philosopher as a philosopher. So I have in mind when I say philosopher, I have in mind some, we can say, the wise. So so I don't have a specific group of people like Avicenna or like Illuminationist, but I use this term. Well, Kashi also uses this philosophy to denote some more vague or general, the wise people. And the second question, muhakkik and muqallid. So it's so that nature. So the question is, so the muqallid, so like taqlid is the nature of people, or something that you acquire in the process of education or something. So the Kashi doesn't explicitly say that some muhakkis are already muhakkis when they were born. So it's a little bit vague. But I think so according to Kashi, so muhakkiks are already muhakkiks when they are born, and muqallids are already muqallids when they are born, because the second duty of philosophers to guide muqallids to this the correct view, in Arabic Rai Sadid, implies that muqallids cannot be muhakkiks, because Kashi says only guide muqallids to have a correct view. He does not say guide muqallids to have the nature of tahqiq, or the nature of the muhakkik. So I think Kashi thinks that this distinction between muhakkik and muqallid is natural. I mean, people are created with this nature. Yeah, this nature.
Mustafa?
Hi, Mustafa Beg here from Exeter University. Hi to everybody who I met last time, and hello to anybody who I've not met. I guess just following up from that, really, and it's hopefully a quick question. When you mentioned Imam al-Razi and saying that he's a imam in his own right, or not merely a student of Ar-Razi, and he shouldn't be defined as that. Can I press you a little bit more on how he differs from Ar-Razi? I mean, when you were using the term philosopher, what was coming to my mind is maybe he's more distinctly philosophical than Ar-Razi, who might be, you know, when you think of him as, of course, an expert in philosophy, but as a theologian. So where does he differ in terms of, I would say, approach, method, and how we can conceptualize him? And I don't know if you've got any particular examples of where in Masail also he might differ from Ar-Razi. Thank you. Thanks for the nice paper.
Thank you very much. The question is the difference, the crucial difference between Razi and Kashi is actually, no, we don't have some crucial difference between Razi and Kashi, because Kashi writes also a work on Usul al-Din. It's called Tuhat al-Ashab. So actually, so I call Kashi as a philosopher in this presentation, but he is also a theologian. So as a scholar, as a thinker, Kashi and Razi are not so much different in terms of what they are doing, and how we can call them. So we can call Kashi as well as a Sunni theologian, philosopher, and as well as logician. So in the same way, we can call Razi a theologian or philosopher or logician. So, but in his work on Usul al-Din, Tuhat al-Ashab, Kashi proceeds, so develops the so-called synthesis of theology, I mean kalam and philosophy, falsafa tradition. But in general, they are not, so these two figures are not so basically the same direction. But I wanted to say that the later thinkers, later logicians call Kashi not Tilmid of Razi, but they call him so Imam or Allama.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was my thinking, actually. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It's just coming up to 1:45, so we should move on. But if there's a very quick question or a very quick comment from anyone, or shall we continue?
There's one in the chat. If you want to take it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Is there a clear distinction between? Oh, you're really kind of. Istran's right, kind of digging it up. Is there a clear distinction between hikmah, aql, and falsafa? I don't think we can do this in a minute. But this is probably something that I mean, maybe we can take this up because I think there will be other papers which will touch on this. I think it's a big issue, but yeah, maybe we can take this up later. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's just I don't want it to. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Thank you, Shashi, and
thank you very much.
I look forward to the final paper, and then we'll be in touch, of course, about that. Right now, the next speaker is myself. So I'll kind of chair myself. I'll be strict with myself as well. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to speak. And I will try and keep it to about 20 minutes because the paper is, well, a version of the paper is on the Dropbox, so people can follow up. So let me try and be as strict with myself as possible. Okay, so the paper which I'm putting forward is called 3 Portraits of a Philosopher in the World of Islam, and it's I guess motivated by trying to think exactly through the sort of question of what we mean by philosophy and what its scope is in Islam, thinking a bit also about the way in which we conceive of different types of philosophy or different modalities of doing philosophy throughout the history, but also I'm kind of making a bit of a case about this term portrait and what I think is happening if we consider the way in which philosophers present themselves and their ideas as a portrait or a sketch. So let me start with that, say a few things about method, and then I will give you three examples, the three portraits that I'm suggesting. So as thinkers from ancient times have noticed, humans have a desire to express themselves, to project and assert their selfhood and their dominion over their environment, to understand, grasp, and master their reality. Plato famously wondered about the human capacity and insatiable desire to know oneself and one's environment, to express oneself as a quintessential human, even to portray oneself as a philosopher. In doing so, humans present a portrait of themselves for others to appreciate, understand, and to be challenged. The possibility of a global philosophy, and that's actually one of the questions I have in my mind, is when we're asking what is philosophy within this Islamic context, is also how does it fit within the emergence of what global philosophy might be today. The possibility of a global philosophy is at least partially predicated on this insight, though one needs to investigate further epistemologies and praxes of the South to find philosophizing everywhere. Definitions, expressions, and features of philosophy vary across cultures. Even the very term that captures philosophy may not exist. But at the very least, what seems to unite these conceptions might be family resemblances. Indeed, portraits themselves are a classic example of a term united by family resemblances. Portraits attempt to capture a reality or even to mirror it, or they occlude in their representation what they claim to represent, or they present traces and vestiges of the person or thing depicted. They might even sketch out key features of the subject so that someone who experiences the portrait might be able to pick out the subject when they encounter it, or they might present a mandala or a talisman that encodes the homologies of the worlds and the key to the intersection of the esoteric and the esoteric. All these elements, the revelatory, the aesthetic, the essential, the self-fashioning, the occult even, are present in the use of the notion of portrait, of the naqsh, to use an appropriate Arab or Persian Urdu term that I wish to present here. A good parable for the multivalence, and even one might say trickery or the irony of the naqsh, is the famous parable of the portrait competition between the Chinese and the Greeks to be adjudicated by Alexander, recounted in Nizami and Rumi, the two famous middle period poets, and which has become commonplace in Persian literature. In Nizami, the sage is asked to adjudicate and to make sense of the winner, to seek within the portraits their truth and reality, and the extent to which the portrait captures and represents reality, between the exceptional realism of the Chinese and the exquisitely polished mirror of the Greeks, to decode the mandala, so to speak. Thus, the function of the philosopher in this sense becomes the work of the hermeneut, attempting to seek the hidden in the manifest portrait. In Rumi, the parable becomes one in which the portrait or the mirror stands in for the heart of the Sufi, or the seeker, whose purity and transparency reveals truth. The perfect portrait in that sense becomes a complete theophany, like the burning bush on Mount Sinai, or the sign of Moses' glowing white hand, or indeed the very throne of God and the heart of the believer, both of which are famously conflated in a hadith homology. The true seeker transcends the confines of exoteric learning, inculcating within themselves the divine theophanies and realizing the very essence of divine certainty. That is a true portrait, and that person is a true imago Dei, Surat al-Rahman in Islamic discourse. Goal of this study, of course, is to say a bit more than just talk about or reflect on what a portrait is. It's to examine the nature of philosophy in Islam and the guises and portraits and masks of the philosopher by examining three rather different case studies to show how we might make sense of this notion of the ambiguity of representation and reproduction in art, and the method for studying the history of Islamic philosophy in Islamic cultures and sketches in the period just before the onset of colonial modernity. There is a sense that this latter epoch makes the portraits more difficult to effect and appreciate. Schizophrenia and an absurdistic attitude makes the mandala increasingly arduous to decipher. Potentially, a surrealist reading of the portrait would leave the door open to the esoteric. but this is not a study in surrealism, nor is it a nod to Borges. Although perhaps Borges's Pierre Menard would find in the vestiges and traces of these philosophical portraits the palimpsestic structure of Islamic philosophy, or perhaps even the collage of philosophy, and the key to what unites the body of a text. But before I get to the three case studies, let me just say something about method. In terms of method, I'm primarily, and strategy, I'm primarily beginning with this issue of the decolonial strategy. You know, how do we understand philosophy in a global sense? How do we read Islamic philosophy as something which is beyond, more than a relic of some sort of ethno-cultural chauvinism and nativism? What can it tell us? What can it contribute to a wider conversation about the nature of inquiry, of lived experience, of the nature of way and forms of life? Global philosophy arguably is motivated by a cosmopolitan ethos of networks of exchange based on dialogue, overlapping reason, and moral disagreement, as well as a desire to sustain and perpetuate a dialogue of rationalities and hermeneutics within a truly multicultural context through a fusion of the horizons of meaning and understanding. Philosophy in this sense needs to be much more than philosophia, a particular Greek heritage of rationality that's informed European philosophy. The main point I think I want to make here is that a decolonial strategy with respect to the study of philosophy, and particularly the study of philosophy in Islam, requires a sort of a double movement, so to speak. It should involve something which looks at what constitutes philosophy in these contexts, look at arguments, thought experiments, ontology, hermeneutics, narratives, even poetics. But the double movement is not just about overcoming a Western condescending gaze that restricts philosophy in Islam to marginal Aristotelianism in the cultures of Islam, or even discerns an Arabic proleptic form of, for example, rationalism or empiricism or Lockeanism or whatever, but also looks beyond the narrowly ratiocinative and the generic boundaries of falsafa, even to a certain extent hikmah, in search of persuasive discourse and argumentation. So what I'm suggesting here is that a decolonial move requires us to think more expansively about what philosophy is and what philosophical arguments are, in the way in which, for example, Peter Adamson has been advocating in recent times. And so, you know, a global philosophy approach to Islamic philosophy should dislodge us from our parochial, highly specialized, perhaps trivial concerns, and reorient us towards the notion that the true task of philosophy is to consider, debate, and keep alive problems that we face as embedded and self-reflective human beings. Now, I have a lot more to say about method, but I'm going to just pick out one thing which is also important for me. So I've already mentioned the first issue about the need to have an expansive definition of philosophy, which goes beyond works which define themselves as falsafa or hikmah. And the other point which I would the second point I'd like to make is this whole question of what philosophy means as a way of life. I've written about this, so I'm not going to say much more about this. It's very much an attempt to try and bring together the idea of philosophy as a coming together of mystical, of intuitions with demonstration, with a particular ethical commitment in an Islamic context, with Pierre Hadot's famous example of philosophy as a set of spiritual exercises. But the third point I want to make here, which is significant, and this then kind of leads me into my 3 case studies, is that I want us to consider the minor figures. This is something I basically got, I'm taking from Richard Rorty's famous article on the history of philosophy 30 odd years ago. And the importance of the minor figures is that they often, those who seem minor to us today, often tell us much more about the way in which philosophy was conducted, and taught and disseminated in particular periods of time. So the study of a minor figure can be a useful insight into the way in which philosophy actually worked, as opposed to, as I said, to looking at the sort of the major figures, the Avicennas of history, or the Mullah Sadras, who have a far greater impact and sort of speak across time. Minor figures allow us to develop a much more discrete and richer sense of what the intellectual history of philosophy in Islam is. Now, coming to my three case studies. So I have three case studies, as I said, which I would argue are very much motivated by these concerns. So my first one is someone who certainly is not normally considered to be a philosopher, and he is actually better known as a Maliki jurist. So this is Abul Abbas Ahmad Baba of Timbuktu, dies in 1627. And he's someone who I would consider as a sort of a legal activist jurist as a philosopher. Now, he's known, as I said, primarily for his works in law. He also wrote a very famous biographical dictionary of Maliki jurists entitled Nail al-Iqtihaj. And he also had an interesting personal experience growing up in Timbuktu and then being taken away as a prisoner, even as a slave, to Marrakesh when the Moroccans invaded and destroyed the old Songhai kingdom. And so he had this experience of living as someone in confinement in Marrakesh. And then, of course, later in life, he manages to return to Timbuktu, where he dies. Now, he doesn't define himself as a philosopher, but he's someone who is considered to be a central figure and symbol of what Islam, or the intellectual history of Islam in West Africa, is. Now, in particular, what I want to do is I want to talk about his views on slavery. And it's a complicated set of issues that he presents, and they're presented in fatwas. But what I think is interesting about them is not just that it's a fairly straightforward presentation of a legal ruling on two levels. Is it permissible to, who is one allowed to enslave? And is there something which is essential about the relationship between being, for example, Black and being a slave? And this was something of significance in his time, and of course it remains significant in the later tradition. If anything, the modern kind of reception, or the modern portrait of Ahmad Baba as someone who is somewhat of an abolitionist, so to speak, or at least someone who is interested in decoupling Blackness from being a slave, and is focused on the dignity of the human, and is concerned more with the way in which peoples are distinguished by religious confession as opposed to by other features that they may or may not have. And what one finds in this is that it's not just a question of the way in which his legal reasoning works based on the sources of Islamic law, but also the way in which he's bringing his own experiences of having been basically a slave, and also of his own reflections on the way in which things actually work in nature. So there's almost an element of an empirical derivation, because he thinks there is nothing essential about race which links it to slavery. It's very much a reflection on his own experiences, and bringing that sort of philosophical reflection of that into his legal reasoning. So his critique of essentialism is very much based on that sort of empirical experience that he has. Now, why do I pick this person? I think Ahmad Baba is interesting because he allows us to think about this more expansive sense of what philosophy may be in philosophical argument, and how it interacts with other disciplines such as legal reasoning in particular, because of what he seems to have to say about the ethics of the human subject, both the person who is doing the inquiry, but also the object of the inquiry, how he sees, for example, the slave as someone who is worthy of empathy and dignity, how he has a certain pride in himself, and where he comes from in his hometown, and how he asserts his own selfhood, alongside his critique of essentialism and an important reflection on why language is significant, and the expression of writing a fatwa and producing works to express a self is important. And in many ways, I think the fact we picked inscribing knowledge, this is something which is such a common feature of intellectual history across the board, that the question of writing, why does one write down certain types of ideas and arguments, is of great significance. Now, my two other examples, I'm going to try and speed up because I'm aware of time. My second example is one of the few women that we have who write on issues which I would consider to be philosophically significant in the 18th century. And this is Salman Begum Nerizi, who flourishes in the middle of the 18th century. She's perhaps best known for being the daughter of a very famous Zahabi Sufi leader, Qutbuddin Nerizi, who was extremely proficient. And what's interesting about Salman Begum is that she is someone who is at the very heart of this particular Sufi order and of the teachings of her father and the nascent Zahabi order, its attachment to the metaphysics of Ibn Arabi, and the way in which Sufi metaphysics are then expressed in poetry and other media. Her two brothers were very significant Sufi leaders in themselves. Her husband, Muhammad Hashim, was in fact the successor, the next leader of the order. And there's an interesting kind of relationship in the early order in which, the head of the order then marries his daughter to his successor. And so in this sense, you find her line going back, for example, to her grandmother, who is the daughter of the first famous Zahabi leader, who is Najibuddin Reza Zargar. And in fact, when she talks about herself in this text, which I'm going to briefly mention, she refers back precisely to this kind of maternal line and link that, in a sense, binds this early order together. Now, the work she has is called Jami al-Kulliyat. It's been published a couple of times, once in the middle of the 20th century, and more recently, the version I have was published in 2008. And she says quite a lot about herself. So, for example, in the introduction, she says this is a work that the slowly servant and servitor of the family of the Prophet has produced, whose pen name is Dua. And this is what I've gleaned from the lights of the sons of philosophy and mysticism. She says it's based on, it's kind of a summary of Fasl al-Khitab, which is a major work by her father, known as the Philosophy of the Mystics, which expounds on the metaphysics of the school of Ibn Arabi. But then she says that she's rendered this into Persian quite simply because most students on the path to God are Persian speakers and do not have sufficient Arabic. And that this Persianization, in a sense, of this set of teachings was based on her own, what she gleaned from her father's classes from the age of 15 to over a 15-year period to when her father died. So there's a sense in which this work is completed when her father died. And this 15-year period is made up of 5 years in Shiraz and then 10 years in Najaf. There are various things which I could say about the text, but I think the main thing to mention, there's two things I want to mention particularly about the text, which I think are interesting. One is the extensive use of poetry, including her own poetry. We find this, for example, even at the end of the text, where she refers in poetry to this work being a product of inspiration and a response to her prayers. And that it was completed in the year 1173, which is 1761, the year her father passed away, just passed away as well. And she then, in the way in which she completes a text, she associates herself, as I said, with these two kind of lineages, the Sufi lineage from the paternal line, and the maternal lineage, which connects the key figures of this particular tradition as well. There is extensive, one feature of the text I think which is useful is that continuous with a lot of Safavid works is the way in which she mixes philosophical reflection with exegesis. So she brings in famous sayings of the Shia Imams, the Quranic verses, and shows how they can be interpreted in a philosophical manner to reflect a certain metaphysics, such that the idea is that metaphysical teachings, whether coming from philosophy or whether coming from revelation, are in a sense ideally compatible in that way. Now, my final example is someone who is far better known as actually being a philosopher, and this is Abd Ali Muhammad, known as Bahr al-Ulum, dies in 1810, who is the son of the founder of the Dars-e-Nizami in North India, in Lucknow. He's a very famous figure. He's an itinerant thinker, well known for being a logician and a philosopher, as well as someone who wrote a very important commentary on an Usul al-Fiqh text, the Musallam al-Thubut. He then also follows different courts. So he spends time in Shah Jahanpur at the Rohilla court, then he moves to Rampur, then he moves to Burdwan in Bengal, and then he moves finally to Arcot, to Madras, where he dies later. It's in Madras where he's given these kind of accolades as being Malik al-Ulama and Bahr al-Ulum. But we find vestiges and traces and sort of portraits, I guess you could say, of this person in all of these places. We find his texts survive, his inscribed texts, his works, his hashiyas, as well as works that he copied in all of these places. Now, what the themes I want to bring out from his work is a deep commitment to logical structures of understanding, and a kind of interesting way of looking at metaphysics in which the semantics of existence, the way in which we talk about terms and what exists and what does not exist, lies very much in the sort of restricted logical structures of the way in which we use language to talk about it. But the actual understanding of metaphysics, insofar as it refers to what exists as such, comes very much from the Ibn Arabi school, and particularly from the doctrine of Wahdat al-Wujud. The other aspect which I would mention here is, and this is perhaps indicative of the 18th century context, is the way in which one sees how, in a sense, Bahr al-Ulum is representing himself as a Sunni metaphysician. And I can say more about this. There's lots of evidence for this, but I think this partly comes out of the conflict that he faced early in his life in Lucknow, and how, in a sense, second half of the 18th century in North India was increasingly seen in terms of intellectual resources being brought in to sort of sectarian conflict, which is ongoing. And this is reflected in a number of the works. It's even reflected in the way in which he presents what he's doing in Fawat al-Rahmut, which is, as mentioned, is this famous work on Usul al-Fiqh, on the Musallam al-Thubut. Now, I'm aware that I've gone out over time, but what I just want to kind of bring things together is by saying, I could have picked many other portraits. There are a number of portraits of philosophers that we can conceive of, which might help us make sense of, or perhaps make philosophy too elastic a concept when we're looking at Islam. Why it's important to consider those who are minor figures, because even though they might be kind of a small smidgen on a wider canvas, they do tell us something about what philosophy or philosophical understanding might have been in a particular point. I was going to end up with the portrait as imposture, but I'll leave that for you to read later. There is an interesting question which might arise, to what extent can we, if we're thinking of the didactic intent of this, could we just actually fictively think about portraits to present, which might help someone to think about what philosophy is in Islam? And I gave a few examples. I give a few examples from the maqamat of Hariri in particular within that context, but I'll leave that for the while. Thank you. Apologies for that very rapid run through. Any questions, any comments? Oh, yeah. I don't know which one went up. So Nadia first.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very, very intriguing paper and the three portraits that you gave. I've just one short question. I mean, I know it's much broader than short, but but it's concerning your notion of philosophy, which on the one hand I find very important and intriguing and fascinating. It's not by accident that in the past few years myself, I've also ventured much more into adab and other fields than classical falsafa. But the concern I have, and this is the question I would like to raise, is, I mean, if you enlarge the notion of philosophy to this extent, even though you were indicating or gesturing towards the methodology that you pursue, I was wondering where would you be able to put the lines and draw some limits, restrictions? I mean, at the end of the day, everything which in a way is reflection then turns out to be philosophy, doesn't it? And I don't know whether we would like to go that far. I mean, thought as such is interesting, but is every thought philosophy? So I was wondering where you could draw some harder lines than just that. And the second question concerns the second example that you gave, which I found very interesting. Salma, I don't know whether that's the way you refer to her, but you were referring to her oeuvre and mentioning that she extensively uses poetry, which I find, of course, very interesting. And of course, with the Western background, we all know of the tension that often is constructed or seen, perceived between falsafa or between philosophy and poetry. So I find very interesting that this is specifically one of the things she does a lot, using poetry. And I was wondering whether you could say a little more about the kind of poetry she uses. Just a few indications, because of course the time is very short today. So thank you very much.
Thanks. I agree. I mean, I think the issue of the elasticity of the term can be a problem. I think the reason why I raise it is partly because I'm kind of aware of the way in which some of the discussion in global philosophy is going at the moment, where you know, the idea that philosophy has to be, first of all, inscribed, written down in a particular way, has to follow certain logical structures, etc., is potentially exclusive, right? Exclusionary, in that it cannot deal with traditions in various parts of the world. And it's also, I think, you know, what I was trying to say about the decolonization of philosophy with respect even to Islam, that then raises questions about, you know, what, for example, Dimitri Gutas has kind of dismissed as paraphilosophy, and everything basically is paraphilosophy in Islam, right? Or everything is philosophy in Islam. So there's two different ways of looking at it. Now, I'm not saying every single fatwa is philosophical. But what I found interesting in this particular work of Ahmed Baba is the way in which he does not draw upon just merely analyzing revealed text, but actually draws upon experience and other elements of what you might consider to be philosophical reasoning, right? I do have further ideas about how you might limit this, but I think at this stage it's probably better just to explode the concept, right? And to really kind of mess things up big time, because I think the way people talk about philosophy in Islam is extremely problematic. And I'm not just talking about the Gutasiya, as I would call them, but I'm talking about, you know, many other people have that approach, and especially those who don't work in philosophy also have a certain assumption about what philosophy is with respect to their own tradition. And so, yeah, I'm not going to say any more now, but hopefully I'll send you my paper, and I'd be very much interested in what you have to say. On the poetry in Salma's work, what's really interesting, it's very consistent with her father's work. So her father extensively uses poetry to express philosophical ideas, right? So it's not actually just like, it's much more than, say, for example, the way in which people quote Shah Ni'matullah Wali or quote Rumi or Attar, and find philosophical meanings in them, right? This is rather, at times the poetry is not great when it's their own poetry, but it's a very explicit idea that the best way to express philosophy is through poetry. Because poetry is a medium which is a much more affective medium, a much more effective medium as well than prose is. So there is a sense of that. And the way in which she uses poetry, a lot of her poetry is her own in the text, the beginning and the end. But sometimes she also does use the classics. So she's using Attar, she's using Sanai, she's using Hafiz, she's using Rumi, etc. But for me, when I first came across this, it was exciting because it's like, oh, I remember this conversation with Peter many years ago. Where are the women philosophers in Islam? And okay, we might be expanding the concept of philosophy, but she has a lot of very interesting things to say about what wujud is, which are philosophically interesting. She has a lot of interesting things to say about the nature of the human and the nature of the human soul and the way in which the soul survives the death of the body and so forth, which are quite interesting in that particular way. So
thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Istvan.
Sorry, I don't have the raise hand sign in my reaction, so I had to raise it manually. So yeah, I have two. I really love this paper, and one thing in this idea of opening up philosophy, it can also help to liberate ourselves from being just scholars, to liberate ourselves as philosophers too, because I find it really, well, the tendency that scholarship must to be separated from thinking and original thought. I think it's a very bad tendency. That's one thing. The other is on the minor figures, and I think this is also a crucial thing, because minor figures, as there is this assumption which that the posterity or our age will know who were the really major figures, and time will sort these things out. This is completely false. So any age has its preferences, any culture has its preferences, and there is a huge amount of just sheer luck of what survives, so it's not true at all that we would have a more objective view on who was a major and who was a minor figure. And it is not just in philosophy, in everything, in arts and music. So, well, just as an example, if we consider that most of Vivaldi's oeuvre was found nearly by accident, no, actually by accident, and would have been lost, and he wasn't considered at all, and then he was considered as a minor and now bigger and bigger author. That's the same in other fields. So yeah, this is a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, this question of minor figures is a big kind of issue, and how things might change, and in some ways in the study of philosophy there are people who perhaps 40, 50 years ago would have been considered minor who are no longer considered minor, or even 60 years ago, right? So in many ways this develops. I'm aware that Elias has his hand up. I'm also aware we're over time. Shall we try and, I don't know, Emily, shall we take Elias's question or shall we leave it till later?
Yeah, go ahead if you like.
Okay, Elias, is your question very quick?
Quick, can I leave it for on the screen? So can I just post it in the...
Yeah, put in the chat and then we'll pick up on it later. in the break. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay. The question is this. So you will see it in the chat. The question being, what are the other faculties of the mind? Okay. So I'm interested in this, not in philosophy only, but in my work, so on. So you can read what De Quincey exhorts his reader never to, and so on. So I leave it to you to enlighten me with what are the other faculties of the mind.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, we'll pick that up later. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. You know, before I segue into Emily, I just want to say one thing, which is, you know, I got a bit carried away with this paper, and I wasn't. At one point, I was wondering whether I was writing a paper about what a portrait is, or whether what philosophy is. And sometimes I think maybe I should write a paper on what I think a portrait is, because that was getting more interesting and kind of into a bit more poetry and art. But I should stick with what I know better, which is philosophy. Okay, so without further delay, let me introduce my colleague, Emily Seelove at Exeter, who is going to be talking about someone she's been working on for a while now, Sakaki. The paper is called The Sorcerer Scholar Sirajuddin Sakaki Between Grammar and Grimoire. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you. I hope everybody is seeing my PowerPoint, but if not, please pipe up and let me know. So this is, yes, my presentation. Hang on a second, there we go, that's better. So this, yeah, it's a Leverhulme funded research project, the Sorcerer's Handbook. The research fellow is Luca Patrizzi. The published version of this essay is actually going to be co-authored with Mohammed Sanad, who you'll hear from on Thursday on a different subject. And I'm just annoyed by the way that my screen is appearing right now. Okay, there, I'm gone. That's better. And there's a little website there if you want to check it out. If you remember the presentation that I gave 2 years ago, which you probably don't, but I sort of briefly summarized the biographies that portray Sakaki, most famous now for his work on grammar, as a sorcerer in the court of the Chagatai Khan. And I also talked a little bit about illusion and the use of language and trickery. So I don't want to repeat myself too much in this presentation, so I'll limit my comments on the biographical dictionaries to say that since then I've seen that what he was described as being in his biographical dictionaries can be reflected in his grimoire. For example, the contemporary account of him by Nesawi in Sirat al-Sultan says that he used magical statues to influence a military campaign. He stopped water flowing with his curses. Well, these are both things that he does tell you how to do in his Shamil, his Kitab al-Shamil, the grimoire. Similarly, the Habib Siyar says that he drew a circle on the ground to capture birds from the sky. The use of the mandal, which is a sort of magic circle, I mean, definitely derived from the same root as mandala, to link it to Sajjad's paper, but it's a magic circle, is a huge feature of his Shamil. That he caused the fires of Baghdad to go out. He tells you how to do that, how to cause fires to go out. And that he would not let them be relit until the vizier of Baghdad kissed a dog's ass and acknowledged Sakaki's magical powers. I mean, this is as a kind of hint of the sort of person he was and the kind of power that he wielded and in what manner. That's kind of the focus of this paper, really, is his personality and his struggle to gain control over a situation. As for the bit about illusion, which I also won't dwell on, I just wanted to share with you very briefly, without reading every word of it, this Niranj, a type of talisman to cause terrifying illusions to appear to people, because it's also recounted in one of his biographical the entries that he did this to a rival at court, and it was the magical battle with a rival at court that landed him in jail, where he died. So it was sort of his downfall, really. But I won't dwell anymore on the biographical dictionaries, and will instead turn to his Miftah al-Ulum, his key to the sciences, which is his now what he is known for. It's a book on language. An abridged version of it is still used to study the Arabic language today. This is, and I'm going to read it in light of his Shamil, his grimoire. So that is really the main goal of this current presentation. I don't want to read you every word of this either, but this is the translation of his introduction to his Miftah, and I've just underlined a couple key points. I mean, as you might expect from an introduction, it praises God. It says that the Quran is the pinnacle sort of the power of the Arabic language, as this is going to be a book on the Arabic language. And it also sort of sets up a dichotomy between those who know and those who don't. The ignorant people, the pontificating masses, you'll see he says there, who are just terrified and baffled by the power of this holy text and try to fight it with swords, and are impotent essentially. And this dichotomy between those who know and those who don't is a very important one to him. He does claim that he has a didactic aim, but I would say that really isn't fulfilled until Qazwini abridges the Miftah into the Talhis of the Miftah, because the Miftah itself is a little bit impenetrable. And all in all, I would say that Sakaki is someone who guards his knowledge rather than seeking to distribute it as widely as possible. And when Hisashi was talking about the importance of writing philosophy down and why you might do it, or knowledge down, let's say, it occurred to me that I haven't really articulated what the purpose of him writing the Miftah really was, because I doubt, having tried to read it myself, only leaning heavily on Muhammad Sanad, my co-author, that it was really intended to illuminate the novice. His Miftah is even more impenetrable. I mean, his Shamil, and that appears to actually be the lecture notes of his students rather than his own writing. So yeah, I mean, I realize now that that's an important question I need to answer, is what is the role of writing if you don't actually intend the people who read it to understand it. Maybe it's kind of a show-off type of thing, but I need to think about that. He returns to this theme of contrasting eloquence with ignorance at the end of his explanation of the derivation of words for root letters, and curtails the discussion there because those who are clever, he says, will find it sufficient, while those who are not are the, quote, slow ones, who by God would never derive any benefit, even if you read the entire Torah and the Bible to them. So this is from the Miftah, but you can also see in his Shamil that he considers the Torah and the Bible to also hold enormous power, perhaps second only to the Quran. And we'll return to the sort of multi-religious atmosphere of this text towards the end of the paper. As his name, Sakaki, the die caster, suggests, he seems to have started his life perhaps as one of the know-nots, one of the ignorant native Persian speaker who was a metal worker. And whether that's the case or not, it's clear that the art of melting and pouring loomed large in his mind. And you can see this image that he begins his introduction with, that speech is poured out in the mold of truth. That's the verb yufrag, which is used repeatedly in the Shamil when you melt metals and pour them into the shape of talismans. And he describes this process, in the tone of a craftsman, in a very practical sort of way, actually. it's interesting to speculate how this process of talisman making, of mixing these metals and gemstones and things like that, can be linked to the process of crafting metaphors and similes, which he also describes in a sort of systematic way in his Miftah. I've thrown a few quotes here together to show how the idea of metaphor and simile might be linked. I don't want to get too bogged down in it. It's a little bit mind altering, but so there are connections between the ma'ani. There's a hakika, like a given definition, and majaz implies a mental insight followed by an effort to apply that word to something else. There's a dictionary definition of sihr as transforming something from its hakika to something else. So basically the idea of them, one thing being linked to another, a certain gemstone being linked to a property, for example, might be likened to the idea of the use of a metaphor to refer to something else. So Kaki begins this discussion of metaphor and similes with very simple likenesses. For example, that roses are red, cheeks are red, so a cheek is like a rose. From there, his comparisons grow increasingly complex. And one of the most extended compares the sun to a crucible of molten gold. Now, this is also found in Jorjani and Fakhreddin Arazi's predecessor text to the Miftah, but Muhammad and I have found that Sakaki expands it and gets kind of personally involved in it. And again, you think, well, maybe this is someone who cares personally about the process of melting and pouring metal. But the metaphor itself is quite striking. The sun is like a pot of molten gold. It's moving around in its crucible, sort of testing its boundaries in this active, almost conscious way. And this, if the sun, if you examine it carefully, he says at the end, to understand its essence is found to be constituted of the two forms, which is the sort of being contained and expanding, which I guess if you think in modern terms is like gravity and combustion. But more than that, I mean, you think the link between gold and the sun and sort of alchemical terms or possibly a play behind all of this. And this is the complex level of metaphor. And he actually gives several other planetary-based examples. For example, a battle is like a night of falling stars, or Mars and Jupiter are like a person going home from a party holding a candle, which I think is rather lovely. The macrocosmic associations that Sakaki's complex metaphors evoke are built upon the microcosmic workings of the words and letters themselves. This subtle alchemy of morphology and syntax that he has just spent 400 pages at this point exhaustively and tediously laying bare. The letters themselves have khawas, or special properties. The same word, of course, used to refer to the hidden properties of gemstones, plants, and other tools in occult text. Letters he writes could be called symbols, linked by their properties of hardness or softness, and by the places they are formed in the mouth to the things they describe. These special properties of letters are similar to the khawas of gemstones, which he describes in the Shamil, linked by their texture, their color, and the places from which they are extracted to the magical effects they can be manipulated to produce. Like letters and words, gemstones are strung together for powerful effect and are mined from the depths of the unseen treasures of creation. Actually, Luca Patrizzi, my research fellow, has written an article about this. And the same gemstones that adorn Arabic love poetry, rubies, carnelian, and jet, for example, are sites of power in the Shamil and in other contexts. And it is striking to me that metaphors used in poetry, the first example I noticed is the gazelle as a symbol of love and beauty, are also found in magic. So if you're writing a love spell, you might want to write it on a gazelle skin. I've put together a quick little list of parts that you find in love magic and love poetry, and in satire and in hate magic. And you find that these things kind of match up. So in love magic, you might use some of these images in source of power and incense. just like in love poetry, you might use these images to describe the beauty of the beloved. And likewise for hate here. He has a face like he squirted mustard up his nose. That's from Hikaido Custom. I had to throw Hikaido Custom in there. It's my party crashing book that I'm always going on about. I would say that there's nothing particularly startling in all this. The associations are almost too obvious to point out, as they're so clearly linked to the spice's pleasant or unpleasant taste or odor. But all that proves is the primacy of affect, the deep, intuitive, emotional connections that we experience that are prior to and at the root and heart of language, the music and metaphor that gave birth even to scientific discourse, which is to say the obviousness of these links exactly reveal the hidden connections between ourselves and the rest of creation, those hidden links and currents needed to produce effective poetry and magic. The sha'ir, or poet, is the knower or the feeler who has a special talent for sniffing out these connections, these metaphors that Sakaki says are the key to rhetorical sorcery. But the basic definition of poetry is less mysterious. It is speech with meter and rhyme. Now, Sakaki emphasizes that poetry must have meter and rhyme on purpose. If you accidentally say something that's in meter and rhyme, that's not poetry. Now, this might be, I shouldn't have put this in because it's going to take too long to explain. This is a cartoon strip that I made based on Jahiz and Abu Nuwas and a lot of other medieval Arabic writers. And you see these two guys are walking through a market, and Jahiz essentially says, poetry is basically defined as speech, which has rhyme and meter. And then Curly, his friend, who's Abu Nuwas, says, how much for the aubergines? 1 coin, and will you try our beans? Okay, says Popeye, poetry is speech that has rhyme and meter on purpose. Now, this is an example taken directly from the Fatah, where he actually gives a market transaction about buying eggplants or aubergines that's accidentally metrical. And he says, that's not poetry. Curly did not intend to write a poem about eggplants. Therefore, the fact that it's metered and rhyme means it's not poetry. So there's like this will behind it, this intention that is essential to this definition and his opinion. But if poetry is inspired by the jinn, is that, did you write it on purpose? A.S. Triton writes in Spirits and Demons, this is me asking this question, writes in Spirits and Demons in Arabia, during a discussion between two poets, one said, I say a poem every hour, but you compose one a month. How is this? The other said, I do not accept from my shaitan what you accept from yours. So it seems like there is this kind of, maybe you have some power over whether you accept a poem from the jinn or not. Likewise, the soothsayer may deliver oracles when they are inspired by a jinn, but are they majnoon? Of course, the prophet himself was accused of being majnoon. Michael Doles writes that when he received his revelations, his critics first accused him of being possessed, but then when told that here is no choking, spasmodic movements and whispering, waswasa, they suggested instead that he was a poet. As for Sakaki, he is at pains to prove that the prophet was not himself the author of the Quran, and ends his miftah with a passionate defense of this argument, which comes back to the poetry question, actually. Anyone, he writes, who would claim that the prophet was the actual author of the Quran as opposed to God being its author, knows nothing of language or of secrets, he says vaguely, asrar. Their leaders, this is a quote, are animals who only lick the trash of philosophy and spout nonsense with their tongues stuck out like panting dogs. This is when Sakaki gets excited. He brings up all his linguistic power. In refuting the claim that the prophet and not God was the author of the Quran, Sakaki first admits that the prophet was the most eloquent of Arabs. Even so, he writes, he could never have fooled the other Arabs, those masters of language, into thinking that God was the author of a text that he wrote himself. After all, the early satirists, Jarir and Frezdek, were so advanced in their mastery of language and so consequently tuned into the unknown that they could anticipate one another's verses, predicting word for word a poem the other would recite. Indeed, it was said that they shared an inspiring jinn. So how could he have fooled people like that into thinking that he wrote a book that God wrote, if they could guess who wrote a poem just by hearing one line of it? One particularly amusing anecdote from this section is about an Arab woman named Sukaina, who is actually criticizing the poetry of Jarir and Farazdak. So even these masters of language made mistakes. And she focuses in on a line from a love poem that says, "Oh, it's so wonderful that we both like the same things, me and my beloved." And she says, "Oh, you both like the same things. I guess that must mean that you like to be penetrated during sex, because presumably your beloved likes that." And kind of shows how this imprecise use of language makes him potentially into a laughingstock. I bring it up because we can find parallels with this, with the care that must be taken in uttering magical incantations. One may seek control over the jinn, but find oneself through carelessness, a misspoken word or phrase, dominated by them instead, or as you might say, screwed, the passive rather than the active partner in the relationship. And Sakaki is all about control in his Miftah and in his grimoire. In his promise to unveil the secrets of metaphor, he writes, "We shall drive them to you in an orderly file, the leader of their pack of benefits and chains, arranging them in an order that tightens the bridle back on the faces of their precious pearls." This is the metaphors that he's talking about. All in all, he seems like a man who strives to keep a firm grasp on his jinn. He doesn't mess around with the types of ritual magic that might do damage to his control. For example, some spells to conjure the power of Venus use wine and sex as ritual tools, and he doesn't. But this is not because he thinks he's unwilling to overstep the bounds of decorum, not at all. In fact, his willingness to go beyond any possible bounds of proper religious conduct in his magical practice earned him the opprobrium or blame of some commentators. But like other famous transgressors in the history of Arabic literature, Abu Nuwas, or Curly here, springs naturally to mind. He was nevertheless a pious Muslim of passionate faith. He was a man of microcosmic contradictions. He ends his Miftah by restating the claim that by studying language, you can avoid dangerous mistakes, and refute those who criticize the Quran as self-contradictory, repetitive, lacking in poetry, or in short, written by a human. So some of these so-called, he refutes these claims that these so-called critics of the Quran are making, he says, about how it's contradictory. And he uses some images that, gosh, I don't know if I have time to even explain this, but he uses these images that are about Solomon's wen and Moses' staff, and says that critics of the Quran say that it's contradictory because it describes the wind and the snake that the staff turns into in different ways at different places, using different words for snake, for example. I think it's pretty implausible that anybody who was a novice in the Arabic language or a non-Muslim would even have the specialized knowledge of the Quranic language to think of this ultimately sort of absurd critique. I think that he put this here at the end of his Miftah rather because these images of Solomon and Moses and his staff are hugely important symbols of the power of language itself, and lead naturally into the content of his shamil, his grimoire. Now, I think I'm running very slightly out of time, but, okay, so, you got to think about where his time and place when trying to make sense of, no, there's one more thing I have to say, I'm sorry. So after he finishes talking about these contradictions, these so-called contradictions, and refuting them, the final argument of the entire Miftah is that the Quran is not poetry, because although certain fragments of verse fit into metrical patterns, and he gives many examples of this, they do so, as it were, by chance, and not because they intend to be poetry. They are not poetry on purpose. And this is the last point that he makes in his entire giant book on language. And I think that the point here is, in both books, is the importance of the will to harness and dominate the dangerous forces of language and magic intentionally, on purpose, to create rhetorical sorcery by the force and training of the will. And he gets quite dark. He goes to some very dark places in his shamel. He doesn't shy away from, you know, what you might call black magic in the least. And I just think that in understanding that, we have to think about the time and place he lived in. I found Navid Kermani's The Terror of God, which is really about Farid al-Attar's book, the Book of Suffering, really useful in thinking about this, because it paints this portrait of the time and place that both Attar and Sakaki lived in, the early days of the Mongol conquest, which was a time of great upheaval. And one famous study of Sakaki, a Balaga and the Sakaki by a man named Matlub, criticizes a poem of his that he includes in his Miftah, saying that it's ugly, it's unpoetic. This proves that Sakaki himself lacked his own inspiring poetic genius. All of the final lines of this poem end with ayyuha zaman. So there's not really a proper rhyme, because in a way the end rhyme is all the same word. But it's all about him bewailing his fate, and how no matter how hard he tries to gain control over his life, fate is always playing tricks on him. And I think also the sort of apostrophe, the poetic apostrophe of "O thou time," really kind of links it to his magical speech, where you address in this a poetic apostrophe is, for example, "O Wild West Wind" by the poet Shelley, which I think it's another strong link between poetry and magical speech, basically. I've written an article about that, a separate article. Well, I'll end with this little pop. I'm going over. I'm sorry. So this is based loosely on the tale in Nasawi, where he tries to help the Shah of Khwarezm defeat the Caliph of Baghdad by actually sending a magical statue to be buried in Baghdad. And for some reason, it's not really explained why, the statue ends up helping the Caliph of Baghdad rather than the Shah of Khwarezm. So it completely backfires, and then they're not able to get back into Baghdad to dig it up again and extract it. And I feel bad, like actually almost looking at this, because it's a bit of a tragic story in a way, and I turned it into a joke. But here you go. There's poor Sakaki. The Shah of Khwarezm approaches him and says, "Court magician, I shall attack the Caliph of Baghdad tomorrow. Make me a talisman to ensure my success. I'll engrave these symbols on your signet ring and you will triumph. Ha ha," says the Shah of Khwarezm. But then the next day, clearly he's gotten the worst of it. And Sakaki says, "Okay, I might have been holding this upside down." And there's some symbols, actually. I copied them from his grimoire. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. We do have a bit of time for questions and comments. So Nadia?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really very fascinating. Just in view of the time, a very short question. So far I didn't know Sakaki's Shamil. I only worked with the Miftah. So I would be very interested if you could say a few more things about this connection between language and magic. That seems to be very important, as you highlighted in the Shamil. So to what extent does he reflect on the power of words or the power of language in terms of magic? Could you say, give a few indications, just that I get a better sense of that? Thank you very much.
So in the Shamil is quite a practical text for the most part. It doesn't get back into the philosophy behind the recipes and rituals that he's describing very much. But the types of technologies that, it's probably pretty typical really of a Qat text. It relies heavily on names, asma, sort of broadly defined, names of God, names of angels, names of jinn. Ayahs, verses of the Quran woven together, using shared words between ayahs, kind of woven into these patterns of power, I suppose. so yeah, just to have the Quran sort of be the beginning and end of his miftah, the ultimate goal of studying Arabic language is to really get a firm, deep understanding of the text, as well as a kind of the power over the angels. In my mind, leads you directly from the miftah to the shamil, where if you really get that highest level of understanding of the holy text, this is the sort of dangerous stuff that you might be able to potentially do with it. And it's interesting too how he holds up the Arabs as these heroes of Arabic language, and looks up to them because, as I said, he was himself a native Persian speaker. I didn't get into it, but it's very clear from his shamil in particular that he lived in an extremely multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious environment. So yeah, well, we could talk about that, but yeah, a few little hints, I suppose.
Any other questions or comments? So let me ask you, Emily, to link it in with Hishash's earlier question about writing. When it comes to spells, I guess, is there a big difference between spells which are written down and which are uttered? I mean, can something which is written down on something have the same power and effect as something which is uttered?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some, I mean, maybe it's par for the course, really, actually, that the talismans and things that he describes have a written element and a spoken element. Sometimes it seems like the written element, he doesn't bother so much, or the scribes or whatever, the students don't bother so much with the dots. So maybe it is, I don't know. Yeah. Why some things are written and some things are said out loud? Good question, actually. Now that I think about it, I don't really know. What's interesting is that when he talks to the jinn, for some reason, he often addresses them in Persian. So he seems to think that maybe the jinn who lived where he lived spoke Persian. But he almost always writes either in Arabic or what my research fellow Luca Patrici has described as Soryaniya, this kind of, original language, an almost mythical sort of language of power, I suppose. Yeah. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't know the answer really. I need to think about it. About the theology language connection. So yes, okay, so yes, about this, the reality of names. So he does, when he says that letters are symbols, this comes in a discussion where he says that he does not think that the words are somehow intrinsically connected to the things themselves. And he gets into that debate about who is the wadir, who is the coiner of language, is it God, is it man? So I don't think that he thinks that the Arabic language, I mean, he definitely privileges it, but I don't think he thinks that it somehow describes in some way ultimate reality. He, like he said, he says it's rams, it's a rams of reality. So this is all in his miftah. Actually, I don't 100% know. So the Mu'tazila features of the miftah are very much that he tries to describe everything logically, so you can't compare one thing to another unless there is a difference between those two things, is one example of a logical argument that he uses. You'd have to enlighten me about how the Mu'tazilas thought about the reality of the names of God, because I don't know that, and that would be useful to me. So maybe you would like to tell me what they thought.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Please do, yes, thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, yeah, so there was this debate about whether the names are actually a dimension of God, whether they represent an actual reality, or whether they are only labels that we attribute to God that do not inherently reflect a particular reality. So it's something like a convention, for example. The latter position was much more prominent among Mu'tazilites, in the sense that if I say God is all powerful, it doesn't mean that power is really inherent in God. It's more like a concept that we use as a label to ascribe to God. And what I hear from you is that, especially when I talk about language as a realms, it seems to be kind of at least in dialogue with that idea, in the sense that we use those terms in order to describe the reality, or especially when it comes to God, rather than say God having different attributes that relate to his ipseity or Zat.
That's very interesting. Thank you. I need to think about that, because actually the last thing that he says in his Shamil, his grimoire, is if there's one thing that you really want to focus on, it is the names of God. That's the most important thing you can think about. So I need to wrap my head around that. So thank you for flagging that up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, somebody, Kezwa just asked about how the Miftah is widely used as a textbook. Actually, it isn't, I don't think, widely read at all. The Talkhis of the Miftah by Qazwini is very widely read and still used to study the Arabic language in Arabic-speaking countries, from what I understand, at a kind of advanced level. But I think it's very much a Talkhis. Like, it isn't the Miftah. It's made easier, simpler, clearer, shorter, all of those things. But it's the Talkhis of the Miftah of Sakaki. So that's what his name now means to everybody. That's what they think of when they hear his name. Whereas a lot of the biographical dictionaries that are more sort of contemporary with him really focus on his reputation as a sorcerer. So I think his reputation has kind of gone from being that of a sorcerer to that of the author of this book of language. And no, because I think pretty much everybody, unless they like magic and are really into it, have forgotten that he was a magician. I don't think it is read almost ever in dialogue with his magical thinking, except by a couple people, namely Travis Sadeh and Michael Noble, have done some really good work on that. And it's been helpful to me in writing this paper.
Cool, thank you. I think we should take the break that we said we'd take. So there is a break until 10 past, and then we've got two more papers by Istvan Kristodnoj and Tetsuro Sumida after that. I'm going to unfortunately have to make my apologies because I have to go to a meeting and then I have to teach. Emily's here as your host now until the end of today. And I will, of course, send everyone the link for tomorrow and then for when we reconvene tomorrow morning. Okay?
Do we just click the same link as we clicked this morning? And
no, I'm going to send a new one because I've got different links for each day, but I'll send that this afternoon to everyone.
So
I guess it's not tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow.
Sorry, yeah, not tomorrow, yeah, Thursday, yeah.
But today, like after the break.
Well, you can just leave it on if you want.
Just leave it on. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would just leave it on. For Thursday, I will send the separate link. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Cheers. Well, have a good rest of the day, and I will see you on Thursday.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Sajjad. Bye-bye.
So I think it just turned 11:10, which is the time we set for the end of our break. Isfan, are you
Yes.
there? Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. All right, let me see here. Where are you? I think I need to make you a co-host in order for you to be able to share your screen.
I won't need it.
You don't need it. Okay.
I will just read.
Okay. So shall I spotlight you? There you are. So welcome back everybody to the second part of our first day. This is my colleague Isfan Christonash. That's not how you say your name. This is ridiculous. I've been here for 5 years. It's Christonash, yeah. Who is my fellow specialist in medieval Arabic literature for the most part, I guess, that you might say. And today he will be talking to us about Greek philosophy in Ibn al-Muqaffa's oeuvre. Please do feel free to introduce yourself any further if you wish to, Chris.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you. So yeah, Ibn al-Muqaffa is interesting in Sajjad's scheme of with Sajjad idea of minor and major figure, because as well, he's considered to be a major figure, definitely, at least in principle in literature, but he as a thinker he is somehow still unrecognized as a major figure, and I think this is a mistake. I think he was really an extremely important thinker on his own right. So that's one thing I wanted to say, just reacting to what we heard before. And also my paper hasn't been uploaded yet because I was mainly working now on the talk version, but I hope to send to you this afternoon a draft of the longer written version. Okay, so I start the talk, which is now titled Philosophy for Politics, Ancient Greek Philosophy Echoed in Ibn al-Muqaffa's Writings. It is widely accepted among scholars of Arabic literature and Islamic studies that Ibn al-Muqaffa's writings are amongst the earliest and foundational pieces of Arabic belles-lettres and fiction, as well as of Islamic nasiha, political and ethical advice literature. Such writings, belonging to the realm of adab, educative and entertaining prose, have been scarcely studied as pertaining to the sphere of philosophy. The works attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa have been little explored from the aspect of the integration of ancient Greek philosophy into Islamic thought. As modern scholars of philosophy tended to disregard advice literature, its importance as a living carrier of philosophical ideas and as philosophy in application escaped most of them. Authors of advice literature were, however, not by definition less deep and original thinkers than the philosophers, and they were often considerably more influential. Furthermore, the two fields were not necessarily as distinct in the view of the authors of either philosophical or advice literature texts as it has been too often in modern academia. The first to write a treatise titled Peribasileias on kingship was probably Aristotle to his disciple Alexander. The goal of this present study is to fill this conceptual gap by investigating the presence and application of elements of ancient Greek philosophy in writings attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa, as well as the aim these texts proclaim. Does the distinction between advice literature and philosophy need revision? Can early Adab texts shed new light on when, how, and why the integration of ancient philosophy into Islamic thought originated? The groundbreaking research by Dimitri Gutas on the movement of translation into Arabic suggests that the initial translations of Greek works were made from Middle Persian intermediaries or compilations, and they were preponderantly of astrological character. Gutas also points out that the exigencies of the religious-political confrontation played a major role in the translation movement. The hypothesis proposed in this present talk consists in the following. One of the means of bringing ancient Greek philosophical ideas and structures into Islamic civilization was the emerging Islamic political advice literature, including writings translated from or influenced by Middle Persian texts. These Middle Persian texts probably comprehended translations of Greek works, but the bulk of this literature, which was not translated from Greek, also absorbed Greek ideas and structures. Rhetoric, logic, and political theories were at least as important for supporting the powerful as astrology. Political advice literature played a crucial part in the assimilation of these elements of Greek philosophy through late antique filters into Islamic civilization, starting possibly already during the rule of the Umayyad Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik, and at the latest by the time of the intermediate aftermath of the revolution that brought the Abbasids to power. The fact that these elements of Greek thought had been already absorbed by late antique civilizations facilitated their early integration into Islamic civilization, which rose and formed in interaction with and building on the cultural and human resources of its late antique, preceding and contemporary counterparts. Today, we'll discuss 3 Adab works and 2 actual political epistles attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa. The Adab works are his translation of Kalila wa Dimna, Kalila and Dimna, as well as the Kitabul Adab al-Kabir, the great book of Adabs, and the Kitabul Adab al-Saghir, the small book of Adab. The political epistles are the Risala fi Sahaba, epistle on the companions of the Caliph, and Al-Yatima, the peerless pearl. Kalila wa Dimna. Ibn al-Muqaffa authored the Arabic version of the quintessential book of advice for princes and rulers and courtiers, Kalila wa Dimna, which consists of a collection of edifying fables and tales featuring both animal and human characters. It includes versions of all the 5 chapters of the Sanskrit Panchatantra, 3 that are part of the Mahabharata, as well as further chapters and a series of introductions. The introductions of Kalila wa Dimna present the text as having originated in India, translated into Pahlavi, Middle Persian, by Burzawai, and then into Arabic by Ibn al-Muqaffa. Ibn al-Muqaffa's original Arabic version does not subsist, but it has been the source of a multitude of variants in Arabic and a number of other languages. It is one of the most global texts in history, and new versions and translations still proliferate. Khalil Abad-Dimna is a prime example for the conflation between philosophy and advanced literature. The Arabic versions are presented in the literary form of a narrative dialogue between a king and a philosopher that frames each chapter after the introductory ones. Strikingly, in the Arabic versions, the wise man advising the ruler is consistently termed philasuf, philosopher, using the Arabicized Greek word. This was probably introduced by Ibn al-Muqaffa, as in the Old Syriac text, which is considered to be a translation of the Middle Persian version, independent from that of Ibn al-Muqaffa, both the king and his advisor of the frame story are always mentioned by name, so not as philasuf. The term itself, corroborated by the guidance given in Ibn al-Muqaffa's preface, demonstrates that he presented this most prominent text of advanced literature as a book of philosophy, enveloped in entertaining examples. Its fables and tales teach politics, rhetoric, and ethic in application, and the inserted intellectual autobiography of Burzavayhi, the Middle Persian translator, exhibits his quest for a meaningful life, resulting in deep religious skepticism and transreligious morality. It is important to note that the text known as the correspondence between Aristotle and Alexander the Great, which is possibly an even earlier specimen of Islamic political advanced literature, is also structured as a dialogue between two parties in the form of a written correspondence and uses the term philasuf. The Kitab al-Adab al-Kabir. Ibn al-Muqaffa's Kitab al-Adab al-Kabir, the great book of adabs, is also an excellent example of the integration of Sasanian cultural patrimony into Arabic advanced literature. It includes different sections of adab, educative advice, for the ruler, his entourage, and for the cultivated man in general. These are preceded by carefully constructed introductory sections. The first refers to a mythical past in which men were superior in every respect to the contemporaries of the author, and the second echoes the notion of the four virtues, reflecting a strong influence of ancient Greek philosophy through Sasanian advanced literature, shaped to fit into an Islamic framework. The idea of the four virtues is also echoed in one of the introductions to Khalil Abad-Dimna. Quote, I found that the things which distinguish man from other animals are four, and they comprise everything in the world. They are wisdom, chastity, reason, and justice. Knowledge and education and thoughtfulness are within wisdom. Magnanimity, patience, and dignity are within reason. Modesty, generosity, protection, and self-respect are within chastity. Sincerity, charity, self-control, and good disposition are included in justice. The conclusion of the Kitab al-Adab al-Kabir includes an account of the perfect man, reflecting the Greek ideal of kalokagatheia. The Kitab al-Adab al-Saghir, the small book of adab. The Kitab al-Adab al-Saghir, also attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa, addresses the intelligent, reasonable man, Aqil, and discusses similar topics as his other adab works based on Middle Persian advanced literature. As compared to the Kitab al-Adab al-Kabir, the extant version of the Kitab al-Adab al-Saghir does not have a conclusion, but its introduction also follows a strict logical structure. Its first sentence presents the use of anadiplosis, repeating the last element of the previous clause at the start of the new one. Quote, all creatures have a need, and all needs have an aim, and all aims have a way." End of quote. This opening continues with a reference to a Quranic verse and develops the argument further. Back to the quote. "And God fixed to the things their time limits, set up to the aims their ways, and prepared to the needs their means. And the aim of the people and their need is the rightness of this life and of the afterlife. And the way to reach them is the sound intellect, and the sign of the soundness of intellect is the choice of things by discernment, and the implementation of the discernment by this determination." End of quote. The following sentences explain why the intellects could need education or manners, adab. The major part of the education or manners relies on logic or speech, mantiq, and there is nothing in the learning and terminology of logic or speech that would not originate from a primary authority or preceding guide, Imam Sabiq, orally transmitted or in a book. And this is a proof that man did not invent its principles, but the science or knowledge, ilm, of its principles came to them from the omniscient, the wise, God. What we see here is an ingenious use of Greek rhetoric blended with Islamic formulas and concepts in an attempt to Islamize the science or knowledge, ilm, of logic or speech, mantiq, by integrating it into an Islamic framework and matching it to the Islamic criteria regarding respectable knowledge. This presentation of the roots of the science or knowledge of logic or speech mirrors the structure of hadith transmission and the general concept that all valuable knowledge has to emanate from a divinely inspired past authority. It was in a similar pattern that grammarians in the 8th and 9th century sanctified the science of speech. With regard to knowledge, action, right and wrong, passion, religion, and intellect, all common themes in Ibn al-Mukaffa's writings deriving from the stock of late antique wisdom, the Kitab al-Adab al-Saghir includes an aphorism that provides another example of anadiplosis and logical structure. Here the quote: "It used to be said, if a man does what he knows it is erroneous, that is passion, and passion is a flow of decency. And if he abandons doing what he knows it is right, that is neglect, and neglect is a flow of religion. And if he ventures into what he does not know whether it is right or erroneous, that is recklessness, and recklessness is a flow of the intellect." End of quote. The contrast between religion and passion is commonplace in Greek philosophy, as well as the use of the rhetorical device of anadiplosis. However, the following passage, parallel to the one just quoted, is not from a Greek philosophical text, but the Denkard 6, the most important Zoroastrian compendium of gnomic Andars literature in Middle Persian. Quote, "Who knows something to be a good deed and does not do it, that is contempt. Contempt is the opponent of character. One who knows something to be a sin and does it, that is lustfulness. Lustfulness is the opponent of wisdom. One who does not know a thing to be either a good deed or a sin, and before he comes to knowledge, he performs it, that is self-love. Self-love is the opponent of religion." Although the Denkard was composed roughly 2 centuries after the Islamic conquest, it draws on Sasanian sources. The fact that Middle Persian advanced literature is one of the most fundamental sources of Islamic advice literature, is often clearly stressed by Islamic texts themselves, such as the above-mentioned translation of the Kalila wa Dimna by Ibn al-Muqaffa. Regarding the limits of one's knowledge, the Kitab al-Adab al-Saghir includes an aphorism related to the Socratic paradox. Quote, "It belongs to knowledge that you know that you do not know what you do not know." This aphorism is very similar to the formulation of the idea in Plato's Charmides. Temperance is the knowledge of what one knows and does not know. But while the Greek version of the Charmides and the Arabic version of the Kitab al-Adab al-Saghir are slightly different, the latter is nearly identical with a Middle Persian version that is included into the Dane card. Sagacity is best, one who knows I do not know, with regards to a thing which he does not know. Political epistles, the Risala fi Sahaba and Al-Yatima. Ibn al-Muqaffa applied late antique theories to pertinent political agendas in both of his surviving political epistles. His Risala fi Sahaba and Al-Yatima are characterized by an elaborate and sophisticated use of logical and rhetorical structures, as well as theories drawn from Sasanian advice literature, which had been already in interaction with Greek thought and had been using such structures, as we saw earlier in the case of the Dane card and Kalila wa Dimna. These antique elements are carefully combined with Quranic references, adapted to an Islamic framework, and used to solidify the rule of the new dynasty, the Abbasids. The extant fragments of Al-Yatima shows conscientious composition, and the entire text of the Risala fi Sahaba is structured according to the theory of the circle of justice that formulate the interdependence of the ruler, the military, the peasants, and the administrators, and was attributed in Islamic texts both to Sasanian authorities and Aristotle. The Risala fi Sahaba also contains another important idea of uncertain origin that became widespread in Islamic political thought. Ibn al-Muqaffa writes that God provides prosperity through an imam, that is, the ruler, who leads the elite, khassa, and through them, the common people. This conception may be related to the hierarchy of power and knowledge, composed of the philosopher lawgiver, the guardians, and the workers in Plato. Instead of this tripartite structure, in Al-Yatima, Ibn al-Muqaffa systematically uses the binary image of the shepherd, Ra'i, and his flock, Ra'iyya, which is not Quranic, but had been a commonplace in ancient literature, including Sumerian texts, the Bible, and Greek philosophy, and became similarly ubiquitous in Islamic political thought. In the Risala fi Sahaba, the treatment of the question of the obedience to the Caliph is also constructed following a clear logical structure and connected to the question of reason and religion. I think actually his sachet, that text would be very, very interesting for you. The extant fragments of Al-Yatima display a similar argumentation. Intriguingly, in this section of the Risala fi Sahaba, Ibn al-Muqaffa's objective is not to measure the absolute truth of the contrasted arguments, but to advise the ruler to embrace the doctrine that can ensure the largest possible support for his rule. This attitude is in perfect harmony with Ibn al-Muqaffa's advice in the Kitab al-Adab al-Kabir, where he articulates the pragmatic role of religion as a political tool. In Ibn al-Muqaffa's oeuvre, religious rhetoric is a powerful element of political rhetoric, and political rhetoric is a key instrument of politics. Conclusions. Ibn al-Muqaffa's oeuvre includes ample evidence of the fact that constituents of diverse cultures of antiquity were in fusion already at the formative stage of Islamic civilization in general and of Islamic advice literature in particular. The texts attributed to Ibn al-Muqaffa show that elements of Greek and Indian philosophy, including political and ethical thought, as well as logic and rhetoric, were organically integrated into Middle Persian advice literature. His writings also reflect the broader tendencies of how components of Greek philosophy, as part of the late antique heritage nurturing Islamic thought, were used in Islamic political, ethical, and religious literature in support of specific interests and values. Ibn al-Muqaffa was a key participant in a collective project providing politics a moral purpose and making of philosophy practical, ethical, and political use. His contribution to the introduction of philosophy into Islamic civilization is even more significant considering that Ibn al-Muqaffa was murdered approximately a century before the death of al-Kindi, labeled the first Arab philosopher. In Islamic advice literature, since its first appearance, Greek elements are commonly mixed with Persian and Indian as well as Arabic and Islamic influences. This calls for caution in reading Islamic advice literature with an exclusivist eye. The fact that concepts and formulations that had characterized ancient Greek philosophy abound in early works of Islamic advice literature that were translated from or influenced by Middle Persian texts, such as the Khalil Dimna and Ibn al-Muqaffa's entire oeuvre, demonstrates that these Greek elements had been already incorporated into Middle Persian advanced literature. Early Islamic literature complements the evidence of late antique texts in providing indirect but strong evidence for an advanced level of coalescence between Greek, Iranian, and Indian thought, preceding already the rise of Islam and allowing for further fusion and elaboration within its new civilization. The Arabic adab works of Ibn al-Muqaffa are the continuation of the Greek Paideia and the Middle Persian Andars. They present practical philosophy, ethics and politics, advice for the elites, Nasiha. Forms and content derived from ancient Greek philosophy, as mediated by late antique sources, appeared in Islamic political advice literature before interest in philosophy as a system of theoretical worldview emerged in Islamic civilization. The political and religious utility of Greek rhetoric, as well as the benefits of Greek science, had been recognized already by the elites of late antiquity, who blended them with the heritage of other civilizations. Translations of late antique political advice literature into Arabic and the creation of Islamic political literature had an instrumental role in the initiation of the translation of Greek philosophical works into Arabic, leading to the creation of what is commonly designated Islamic philosophy. Greek philosophical influences did not reach only the philosophical circles or philosophizing theological milieus, but also affected the realms of secretaries and jurists, already at an early stage of the formation of Islamic civilization, 8th, 9th centuries AD. The first extant translations into Arabic belonged to political advice literature. These texts included already important components of Greek philosophy, namely rhetorical and logical devices, as well as political and ethical ideas and patterns, such as the relationship between the ruler and the philosopher-advisor. All these elements provided powerful ammunition in political struggles. The Islamization of them immediately began in order to allow their acceptance by Muslim audiences and their use in religious arguments, which themselves underpinned political claims. The influence of Greek philosophy shaped both the methods and the contents of Islamic advice literature. Authors of advice literature were amongst the first to appropriate Greek rhetorical devices, logic, and theories, and adapt them into Islamic frameworks. Meanwhile, they integrated into their works the ideas they deemed relevant for their times and concerns, and reshaped them accordingly. An analysis of how they maintained and modified the late antique legacy gives significant insights into their agendas. Their fields of interest include the entire realm of power, good, mediocre, and bad government, rulers and courtiers, advisors, as well as the relationship between the ruler and his advisor, the ruler and the elite, between members of this elite, and between the ruler, the elite, and the common subjects.
It's fun.
I'm finishing.
Okay, all right.
I'm finishing. They deal with individual traits of character and the know-how adab required in different roles, as well as with institutions and social strata. Their views express political and ethical ideals and reflect social realities. Producing or commissioning advice literature presented a subtle means for negotiations for power, authority, and resources, and for claiming or consolidating status. While often regarded or disregarded as tiresomely platitudinous, works of Islamic advice literature, if contextualized and studied with a comparative approach, offer rich and exciting material for intellectual and social history. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So it might be that the chat box is the best way to. Are you still spotlighted or no? No. Move spotlight. Good, perfect. Okay. The questions. I'm sorry, I was made chair at the last minute here, and I'm doing a so-so job. Any questions for Isfan? I'm looking for raised hands and not seeing any. If you do have a question, you might just unmute your mic and pipe up.
I can ask you a question, Emily, if there's time.
Please do.
Okay, Isfan.
Hi, Rob.
You said at one point that we need to think again about the beginnings of philosophy in Islam, because Ibn al-Muqaffa, if I understood you correctly, it produces a series of sort of broadly philosophical themes coming through in his work, and this predates some of the other dates that we see as the beginning of philosophy, which sort of links up with Sajjad's argument that philosophy can be found in non-philosophical texts. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Do you think that we've been too strict in the past in what counts as philosophy in Islam when describing Islamic philosophy, and we should start looking elsewhere? Or is this philosophical ideas which appear in other texts, but we're not really talking about philosophy here?
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Actually, it allows me to summarize the whole essence of my talk, which was probably too long and too tiresomely platitudinous itself. So it is that. Well, first of all, I think this difference between categories like advice literature and wisdom literature and philosophy is not necessarily of the making of the authors themselves, but of academia and our compartmentalization, not theirs. This is not an absolute truth, because that we have texts of advanced literature, like one attributed to Al-Ghazali, which is, of course, deeply philosophical, but at the same time, he attacks philosophers in it. So we can see distinction there, but it's not general, this distinction. And actually, the Khalil Adimna explicitly calls itself a book of philosophy and used the term philosopher. I wouldn't say it for the first time in Arabic as known, because this other text, the correspondence between Alexander the Great and Aristotle, also has the same term, philosophy, and this might be even earlier, one generation earlier to Ibn al-Muqaffa. So, though their actual authors probably knew each other. So yes, that's one thing, that adab, especially nasiha and falsafa, were not seen when the first originated, adab originated, were not seen as different categories. The other point is that actually it is in advanced literature that philosophy enters first into Islamic thought, and I think this is for good reason. So Ibn al-Muqaffa was writing in a time when paper was not used yet. Books were extremely expensive, and there had to be a good reason to use a prime secretary like Ibn al-Muqaffa was to translate things. And well, so people had to pay for that, and or at least give patronage for such activities. Now, well, and these were people on power, or very powerful people who could finance such projects. And these very powerful people really needed theoretical and practical advice on how to do politics. It was a matter for survival for both the advisor and the ruler. At the times of the Abbasid revolution, it was not at all sure who is going to live next day. So they badly needed this as practical advice and also as ideological matter. So I think well, in a Maslowian pyramid, political advice and advice, practical advice for survival and rule came first before coming to purely theoretical philosophy, which appeared later. So that yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Salman. Lovely paper, and I'm fear there's another question in the chat, but in the interest of time, it might be that you that needs to be resolved in the chat box, where the earlier translated Greek text on politics or not. But is it okay?
Just a very quick reply. Just a very quick reply to this. It's complicated because there is this letter, this correspondence between Alexander and Aristotle, and well, Alexander and Aristotle, that's clearly Greek, and it probably goes back to, in fact, Aristotle. I now learned that he supposedly wrote such letter in Greek. So, but whether it was translated from Greek or from Persian, that's highly questionable. So what? Yeah, lot of Greek texts and even more of Greek ideas, and Greek, of course, it's itself an umbrella for all Hellenistic stuff. and entered into Islam through Middle Persian, Sasanian text.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's really interesting to see how all these papers, these various presentations are magically linking up. Let's move on to the next, if that's okay, which will be delivered by Tetsuro Sumida. And the title is Canceling the Apocalypse, Refracted Anticipation for the Awaited Mahdi in Sayyid Muhammad Moshasha's Messianic Discourse. And I did make you the co-host. So excellent. Look, we've got our screen shared. Please begin. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. My name is Tetsuro Sumida. I am now speaking from Kyoto. Today, I talk about the Messianism in the post-Mongol Iran. Especially, I would like to focus on one self-proclaimed Mahdi, Sayyid Muhammad al-Mushashar, and his routinized messianic authority presented in his work, Kalam al-Mahdi. In this paper, I initially provide a brief overview of Sayyid Muhammad's career and work. And in the following analysis, I will first argue that his thesis of the 12 Imams' immortality is a prerequisite for denying the manifestation of the awaited Mahdi. And then I will argue. Then I analyze Sayyid Muhammad's alleged status as hijab of the hidden Imam. Finally, I will demonstrate Kalam al-Mahdi has two conceptualizations of the Mahdi of different quality by focusing on the thesis of God's ordeal. The murder of the last Abbasid Caliph was followed by deeply messianic centuries in the Persianate world. This lack of central religious authority increasingly reinforced millenarian movements that commonly expected for the advent of a new dispensation by the awaited Messiah. The messianism in that age was intertwined with other currents such as Sufism and Aridism, and several messianic claimants to religio-political supremacy appeared intermittently. Nourished from this millenarian soil, the Sahabite Sufi network transformed from a moderate Sufi order to a militant messianic movement in the middle 15th century. This culminated in the young Shaykh Ismail's establishment of the Sahabite state in the early 16th century. One of those self-proclaimed Mahdis, Sayyid Muhammad al-Mushashar, and his Mahdism are the subjects of this paper. In the middle 15th century, he successfully established his own dynasty in Khuzestan province by gathering supporters from nomadic Arabs in the marshland of southern Iraq. This success in turn might have obliged him to restrain the messianic expectation while maintaining his own charismatic authority. This paper's aim is explanation that Sayyid Muhammad's Mahdism is in his Kalam al-Mahdi is routinized to fit his status quo, that is, his being a ruler of the already established Mushashid dynasty, and demonstration that his Mahdism is speculatively built up with several unusual theses, namely the immortality of all of 12 Imams, theory of hijab, and God's order. Several theses presented in Kalam al-Mahdi have attracted scholarly interest since Ahmad Kasravi's discovery of the work. Kasravi and other scholars established that Sayyid Muhammad put forth unusual ideas, such as the deification of Ali and the immortality of all of the 12 Imams. However, these studies generally limit themselves to enumerating Sayyid Muhammad's theses and do not systematically explain the whole design of his Mahdi theory. In my opinion, the Mahdism developed in Kalam al-Mahdi is characterized by the speculative manner of its construction. Accordingly, I stress the interconnection between his tenets in Kalam al-Mahdi and argue that the overall concept of Sayyid Muhammad's Mahdism is supported by the theses treated separately in the previous studies. Sayyid Muhammad was born in Washt around the turn of 15th century. In his youth, he migrated from his birthplace to Hira, where he trained under the supervision of Ibn Fahd al-Hidri, the well-known Shi'i Sufi and jurist. Sayyid Muhammad was eventually excommunicated by his master because of his claim to be the awaited Mahdi. Then Sayyid Muhammad fled to Jazair province in southern Iraq, where he gained followers among the nomadic Arabs. In that age, Timurids and Karakoyunlu had been struggling with each other for political supremacy, and Khuzestan province was particularly contested. Sayyid Muhammad took advantage of the prevailing political unrest to conquer Huwaiza in Khuzestan in 1445-6, and he finally established his authority in Khuzestan. After this conquest, Sayyid Muhammad is reported to concentrate on internal affairs and writing until his death in 1466. Sayyid Muhammad's Arabic work, Kalam al-Mahdi, Mahdi's Discourse, is a compilation of his teachings and epistles sent to hostile ulama and local authorities. Four manuscripts have been preserved in Iran. Out of these four manuscripts, this paper utilizes the one preserved in Marashi Library, which has survived without Lakhnae. The precise circumstances of the work's compilation are uncertain. However, it seems to have been assembled at some point after Sayyid Muhammad's establishment of Mushashid dynasty, because the latest data contained in Kalam al-Mahdi is 1460. This estimation of its compilation date is supported by content that tend to routinize Mahdistic anticipation. The basic frame of Sayyid Muhammad's Mahdism is a duality that the hidden Imam of 12th Shiite is identified with the awaited Mahdi, and Sayyid Muhammad himself is positioned as the deputy of the hidden Imam. In order to explain his Mahdism, this paper focuses on 3 points, namely denial of the hidden Imam's manifestation as the awaited Mahdi, and modeling the deputyship of the hidden Imam, and justification of the author's deputyship of the hidden Imam. As pointed out in the previous slide, Sayyid Muhammad had the belief that the hidden Imam would be the awaited Mahdi. So in this sense, he seems to belong to the 12 Shiites. However, he declares his disagreement with 12 Shiite discourse and argues that the hidden Imam would not manifest as the awaited Mahdi. In Kalam al-Mahdi, the impossibility of the manifestation of the hidden Imam is demonstrated by employing a paradox over selection. In this demonstration, the thesis of the immortality of the 12 Imams is invoked and used to assert the impossibility of the manifestation of the awaited Mahdi. Here is the outline of his reasoning. God is not able to select the hidden imam to manifest as the awaited Mahdi because the hidden imam and the other 11 imams are equal in the sense that none of them is dead. Because the act of selection in principle cannot be applied to subjects that cannot be distinguished from each other by the selector. The citation in this slide below means that the hidden imam could manifest himself only when the other 11 imams are dead. However, the author argues in reverse that the proposition of the manifestation of the hidden imam is false because the premise of the death of the other imams is false. Slide 10. The thesis of the immortality of the 11 imams in Kalam al-Mahdi involves the commonly shared belief that the spirit survives after the collapse of the body. Inside Muhammad's view, the verses of Quran that testify to the immortality of believers should be interpreted quite literally. The author thus considers that the believer's immortality expounded in Quran refers to the persistence of the spirit, and he declares that the 11 imams are concealed by God in the same manner as the hidden imam. To deny the actual manifestation of the awaited Mahdi, Sayyid Muhammad interestingly employs a certain paradox concerning selection. The quotation in this slide clearly expresses the incompatibility of the 12 imams' survival with the actual manifestation of the hidden imam. The text reads, because all of them are alive, the last one of them, that is the hidden imam, is not preponderant over the other imams on the manifestation. This results in preponderance without preponderant, and therefore it is impossible. As this citation shows, it seems that the phrase preponderance without preponderant holds the key. In short, the expression tarjih min gair murajjah in previous slide refers to the problem of choice without preference. This paradox is commonly known today as Buridan's ass, which states that if someone is obliged to select something among things absolutely equal to each other, he had no motive or necessity to choose one over the other, and thus cannot select either. Sayyid Muhammad's logic for denying the manifestation of the hidden imam may be summarized as follows. Because the other 11 imams are equivalent to the hidden imam in the sense that none of them are dead. God is torn between them in his selection of the Mahdi. Hence, the hidden imam never manifests himself as the Mahdi. In the following, I focus on Sayyid Muhammad's claim for the deputyship of the hidden imam, which is explained by his unique idea, hijab. The passages in this slide underlines the author's claim to be the deputy of the hidden imam. Text reads, this side is a hijab and a tool for this invisible secret, that is the hidden imam, and his deputy during the occultation. The Sayyid Muhammad formulates the theory concerning the idea of hijab on the basis of his interpretation to several episodes in the tradition. The instances given in Karabul Mahdi are episodes involving Gabriel, who reportedly appeared in various human forms during his duties, and God's invocation to Moses, at which God addressed to Moses from the burning bush. Sayyid Muhammad adduces these examples to present his view that an unchangeable essence can take several different forms. In short, the author defines hijab as a visible form in which an essence is veiled. His infamous thesis of the deification of Ali is also explained in relation to this hijab theory, in the sense that God was using Ali as his hijab. The text reads, it is obvious by clear evidence that Ali, the legate of Muhammad, was God who veiled himself in that possible body. In accordance with this supporting example, the notion of hijab is conceived in terms of deputyship, whereby the impassible essence interact with the material world. In this context, it may be deduced that his infamous thesis of the divinity of Ali was to provide a model for Sayyid Muhammad's self-identification as hijab of the hidden Imam. As the citation in this slide shows, the author analogizes his own deputyship with that of the body for the spirit. In his view, all human actions originate from the spirit, and human acts are performed through the meditation of the body. In other words, human activities cannot be actualized in the physical world without the body as an intermediary. In parallel with this partnership between spirit and body, Sayyid Muhammad constrains the hidden Imam to require deputy as his body or hijab. In the following, I shall explore Sayyid Muhammad's justification for his claim for the deputyship. Careful reading of the relevant passages illustrate two kinds of concept of Mahdi. One is a messianic Mahdi attributed to the hidden Imam, and the other is a non-messianic and weak Mahdi attributed to Sayyid Muhammad himself. Remarkably, the complementary relationship between Sayyid Muhammad and the hidden Imam is established through the thesis of God's order that enables the author to justify his own deputyship. Karabul Mahdi contains some passages depicting the hidden Imam's messianic power to be wielded at his hypothetical manifestation, although it is denied. According to the author, the inadequacy of hidden Imam manifestation lies in this point, because God's order could not be carried out by the awaited Mahdi who has the messianic potency, which would nullify all struggle against himself. The citation in this slide reads, in such case, that is, if the Mahdi himself, manifested himself with the messianic power, then the order would not be accomplished, because the order is not carried out through flight or impulsion, and the obliged one would be rewarded only through voluntary action. Nay, what is incumbent is the order in the same situation as when the Prophet Muhammad manifested himself. This passage frames the notion of the order by analogy with the adversities experienced by the Prophet Muhammad when he propagated Islam. According to Sayyid Muhammad, God plans an ordeal in which the accomplishment of the obligation is used as a test of each Muslim that determines whether they deserve salvation. Sayyid Muhammad's discourse on the ordeal can be summarized as follows. If the hidden Imam were to manifest himself as the awaited Mahdi, individual would have no choice in the ordeal, as none would be able to resist Mahdi's transcendent strength. In such case, the ordeal is not realized, and it would be impossible to distinguish the pious from the vicious among the Ummah. Therefore, God requires a weak appointee akin to the Prophet Muhammad, who was obliged to suffer numerous hardships during his promulgation of Islam. It is noteworthy that some passages in Kalam al-Mahdi terms such a weak appointee with the Mahdi of community, Mahdi al-Ummah. This citation described Sayyid Muhammad as a weak Mahdi. It reads, if the hidden Imam's status and power during the occultation are such, why will he fight or require supporters? Nay, this weak one manifests himself, so that his weakness requires supporters who support him, and God imposes the ordeal on the heart of people through him. The manifestation of the Mahdi of community follows the quality of the manifestation of the Prophet Muhammad, who lived in Makkah until the age of 52 and then escaped to the cave as a proof for the people of this world. For the hidden Imam who is concealed from eyesight, it is not permissible to manifest himself. Rather, a weak person manifests himself in the same way as manifestation of the Prophet Muhammad. Thus, the hidden Imam is secret, and this weak one is his hijab and duty. In conclusion of this paper, I would like to summarize the features of Sayyid Muhammad's Mahdi theory. The quality of the Mahdi Sayyid Muhammad attributed to himself is defined as a de facto ruler who is not as transcendent as conventionally expected. I can also conclude that this realistic Mahdi who actually manifested was paradoxically legitimated by his quality as an ordinary man who was unable to realize his own theocratic state without help of followers who shared his messianic cause. In other words, the Mahdi theory constructed in Kalam al-Mahdi reflected the routinization of the eschatological expectation on which Sayyid Muhammad had relied. His self-proclamation as the Mahdi was developed with the selective extraction of the religious-political authority inherently attributed to the hidden Imam, the host of the apocalypse. This is all for my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So much good thought in there. Again, any questions? To be honest, the raising hand function isn't the clearest. Could you, let's see, would it be possible to unshare your screen, Sumita, just so that I can see
Okay.
everybody and see if they've raised their hand?
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Okay, so yes, so please do raise your hand, put it in a chat, or if you're feeling bold, just unmute your microphone and speak.
Please ask me slowly with quite simple English, please.
Okay, yes, slowly and clearly. You're in the chat.
So may I ask a question?
Please do, yeah.
So I have a question and a comment or suggestion. So that question is, it is related to my presentation in the morning. So that someone compiled these courses, so these theories of Mahdi as a Mushahad in a later period, right? So I mean, so these words may be attributed directly to the Mahdi, but as someone later compiled it, put together in a codex. So under the title Kalam al-Mahdi. So do you think is there any so the compiler or editor had an political intention to demonstrate the legitimacy of the dynasty, or do you think as the compilation or the edited volume was just as a what's like philosophical intention? I mean, is it that the editor wanted to put some like a scholarly or philosophical or religious investigation? So do you have any idea about the intention of the edition or the compilation of the words of Mahdi? And the suggestion with the other comment is, so you mentioned that tarjih غير مرجح. So you wrote مرجح, but I think it's a مرجح. So the idea is so if someone is dead, so if one of the imams are dead, it has something that makes that dead person more deserving to the hidden imam. So it's I think it should be read as murajjah, so something that makes that person more deserving to the position. So yeah. So this is my suggestion. So I mean murajjah rather than murajjah. Thank you.
Thank you, your kind comment. And unfortunately, I have no information on its compiling aim, but out of 4 manuscripts of Kalam al-Mahdi, the one preserved in Marashi Lab, this manuscript, and the sentence that states deification of Ali is God. This section is very annotated refutation comment with the deification of Ali. So it is no idea. The later compiler or copier, maker of manuscript have I have no idea about this, and unfortunately, the other works of Sayyid Muhammad is not left.
So thank you. So there's no historical information about the compilation of the work. So there's
yes, and there are no information on its compilation circumstances.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought your presentation presupposed that the work was from Sayyid Muhammad himself. Wasn't that the case?
Please ask me. I couldn't catch up your question.
I thought that your presentation was based on the presupposition that the work came from Sayyid Mahdi himself. But wasn't
yes,
that the case?
I think so.
Okay. So there was a original compilation by himself. That's your understanding, isn't that?
I'm not sure that by the completion is uncertain whether Sayyid Muhammad himself done or not, but the text is eventually written by the Mahdi, I think.
So the Mahdi himself wrote these words. So he didn't just speak, but he wrote. So it's different to like like Prophet's tradition in Hadith. Prophet spoke, and then someone recorded or someone memorized it, and the later compiled. Someone compiled these words. But in your you think that Kalam al-Mahdi was written by Mahdi himself?
I think so. I think written. But compiler is perhaps not him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's now 12:20, and since I have been made chair, may I make a general observation about today, which is that in all these equally fascinating papers, I'm seeing so many occult connections that it makes me hopeful that at the end of this conference, we'll all have some kind of collective revelation. And if it was up to me, I would press you a little more, Sumida, on what the exact meaning of Hakika and Majaz was about the death of the Mahdi, because obviously that's interesting to me from a linguistic perspective. So that's just one example that I've seen. I hope everybody else feels the same way, that this has been a promising first day. Kazuo, I don't know if you wanted to say anything as a word of farewell before tomorrow.
Nothing substantial, but yeah, well, I enjoyed all the papers, and I'm looking forward to the day after tomorrow.
Me too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. Is that okay for me to now say goodbye? And
I think so. Thank you very much.
okay.
Thank you very much for.
Thank you.
See you the day after tomorrow. Bye bye.
See you Saturday.
Goodbye, everyone.